Hi everyone, my name is Leanne and today I'm bringing you a video all about one of my favourite books of all time, Middlemarch by George Eliot. Now this video has been kind of prompted by two things that are related. First of all, Claire Fenby has been running the incredible Middlemarchalong, where she has brought together a community of people to read this book throughout July, and it has now been extended into August. And also some conversations I had with Kieran based on his reading experiences of the novel, which were quite different to mine, and we had some really interesting conversations about the book. But I wanted to put my full thoughts in a video, a proper lengthy analysis video, which isn't something that I ever really do on this channel. I'm not a huge classics reader. You would be forgiven for assuming so based on the fact I sit in front of my classic shelves. I did do an English degree and I studied this book as part of my second year at university, and it came at a really interesting point in my education for me, because it was at that point where I kind of realised that I didn't want to go into academia. I realised that doing these really deep dives on these books, being really analytical, looking at all of these really clever literary theories, just wasn't what sparked joy for me when it came to books. I was feeling kind of down about myself because of that, and then Middlemarch came along and this kind of in-depth analysis just flowed from me. I found it came so naturally to me and I was really enjoying it. So in this video I am going to be doing a deep dive on some of my thoughts on Middlemarch, particularly Middlemarch and marriage and gender, and I'm going to be examining the evolving social and personal attitudes to marriage and love as depicted in Middlemarch, by arguing that George Eliot anticipates modern marriage by critiquing traditional Victorian values. The applicable aspects of modern marriage I'm going to be looking at are shifting gender roles, sexuality, and a dismissal of social class as a primary reason for choosing a partner. I'm going to be applying close textual analysis as well as a new historical approach. My English degree didn't go to waste. To examine how Middlemarch is conditioned by its historical context. So let's dive into the history. So the 19th century was a time of significant social and political upheaval. Societal norms were being questioned across Europe as there were numerous revolutions that called for equality. Industry and progress forced governmental action as workers fought for their rights in a society long based on status, birthright, and hierarchy. Women's issues were also a major point for people who were interested in propelling England to a more equal ground. And of course, at this time, marriage and gender are inextricably linked, so we're going to be talking about them both. Women were expected to marry men of equal social standing and fulfill three main functions: obeying and satisfying one's husband, keeping one's children physically and morally sound, and maintaining the household, cleaning, washing, etc. I would not be a good wife in the olden days. I can't even keep myself morally sound. These were the only functions that women had, and stepping outside of these roles was not only generally frowned upon, but hostilely criticised. And as the various inequalities of life in England came to the forefront of people's attention, so too did the disadvantage faced by women in their homes and their marriages. Middlemarch was a means of expressing these attitudes of long-suffering wives in a changing climate. In general, 18th century England emphasised rational thought over emotion, and being emotional was considered a weakness. The Age of Enlightenment emphasised sense over sensibility. I actually really love Sense and Sensibility, and that is one classic that I could do another video like this on, so let me know if you would be interested. And the function of marriage was really just to maintain social order. Conservatives warned that unions based on love or affection, based on the desire for personal happiness, were inherently unstable and therefore discouraged. In fact, the idea of marrying for love and happiness raised questions which threatened the very fabrics of this society. If men and women could be true soulmates, why should they not be equal partners in society? Something changed though at the end of the 18th century, continued long into the 19th century, and really gained momentum in Victorian England. Modern marriage emerged in the period between the American Revolution and 1830. During those 50 years, love became the most celebrated reason to enter into a marriage. Even if property, family, and social status did continue to weigh in on the decision, and I think as much as we would like to think that's not the case, those things do still weigh in on our decisions now. As there were so many sweeping changes across Victorian society, industrialisation, social reform, emerging science, all of these things are also covered in Middlemarch, but we haven't got the time to get into all of those. As all of those other things were changing, so were people's approaches to marriage. And of course, 19th century literature reflected these changes. Writing about marriage and romance is not new. Shakespeare did it, Jane Austen did it, A bunch of other writers did it. However, in the latter part of the 19th century, writers such as George Eliot transcended Victorian conventions and anticipated the revisions to social attitudes towards marriage that would carry England into the modern age. We're already quite a way into this video and I haven't actually really touched on the novel that much. It's also so heavy. I'm just gonna put it back here. Is that okay? So Middlemarch was published in 1871 to 1872, but is set in the years preceding the Reform Bill of 1832. Eliot's purpose in setting her novel 50 years prior to when it was written was to adopt the role of the imaginative historian, even a scientific investigator, who seeks to analyse political and social issues through the lives of individual characters. We see how these big historical moments affect individuals in a very specific way. Middlemarch is ultimately a novel about how humans react to change, whether they adopt or they resist, whether they roll with the changes, and characters react in very different ways, whether these changes impact their social intercourse, their family relationships, their professions. Not only do I find George Eliot's analysis of marriage to be interesting in terms of the theme, I also find it really structurally interesting. Up until this point, a lot of writers had used marriage as the happily ever after. It happens at the end of the book. It's what the characters are working towards. And when they get married, the book's over. The book is tied up in a nice little neat bow. Everyone lived happily ever after, rode off into the sunset. It's fine. Middlemarch refuses to do that. Middlemarch is messy. Middlemarch has marriage as the primary focus. The novel's heroine, Dorothea Brooke, marries Mr. Cassavon in chapter 10 when there are over 70 chapters left. This placement allows George Eliot to explore vexed unions, to explore the issues with matches like Dorothea's and Cassavon's. By treating marriage as the subject of the novel rather than the effect, complex and dynamic representations of marriages emerge. The reader observes the utterly disappointing marriage between Dorothea and Cassavon. Dorothea was once really hopeful about the prospects of this marriage, but Cassavon has completely different ideas, traditional ideas, about what a marriage should be. Dorothea anticipates that her marriage would deliver her from the girlish subjection to her own ignorance and give her the freedom of voluntary submission to a guide who would take her along the grandest path. Because Cassavon is a self-proclaimed scholar and Dorothea's greatest desire is for knowledge, she muses, "I should learn everything then. It would be my duty to study that I might help him the better in his great works. It would be like marrying Pascal. I should learn to see the world by the same light as great men have seen it." Cassavon, on the other hand, believed that he had found even more than he demanded. Dorothea might be such a helpmate to him as would enable him to dispense with a hired secretary. You what, bruv? Because she is a modest young lady with the purely appreciative, unambitious abilities of her sex, who is sure to think her husband's mind powerful. Just gonna let that one sit for a second. Now, my thought about why most classics are still books that are popular and read is because a lot of the themes in them are still applicable to contemporary society. Do not tell me that there are not men out there now who are like, yeah, I'm a bit of a big deal. Got a PhD, if you know what I mean. And like, you're clever too. Just don't be too clever. I need you to be clever enough to tidy up after me. Yeah, you're pretty clever too, but not as smart as me. Maybe you can remember people's birthdays and do that kind of organizing stuff. That would be great. I think you would be great at that. I'll do the really clever stuff though, Maybe I'm projecting here, I don't know. Anyway, what I'm saying is Cassavon expects Dorothea to be subservient. He's very traditional. It's just not gonna work. And Dorothea's admiration for Cassavon dwindles when she finds out basically all of his work has already been done by someone else and it's not that important. The marital situation worsens, as does Dorothea's regret, as does Cassavon's health. Dorothea descends into a reaction of a rebellious anger, stronger than any she had felt since her marriage. The narrator regards Dorothea in a sympathetic manner, stating that in such a crisis as this, some women begin to hate. I'd be pretty pissed off, not gonna lie. Dorothea's just too kind and understanding though. And Dorothea's loss of hope for her marriage is something that I think would have resonated with a lot of women at that time. If the marriage had happened at the end of the novel, all of this would have been lost. So through placing the marriage at the beginning of the novel, Eliot uses her structure to further critique traditional marriages. Because love and happiness were not significant reasons for seeking a partner, many couples married without having spent a significant amount of time together and getting to know one another. People didn't fall in love, they tiptoed into it. The idea was basically that they had their entire married lives to get to know one another. You've got decades to figure out if they don't like mushrooms, don't like dogs, support Liverpool, or vote Conservative. They're my deal breakers if anyone was wondering. Dorothea meets Cassavon in chapter 2, has 3 more conversations with him, and is convinced her first impression was justified. He proposes in chapter 5, and they are married 5 short chapters later. And this timeline is dictated by the society around them. That's how fast they gotta move. By fusing structure with substance in order to evaluate the hegemonic standard. Eliot offers a harsh critique of marriage in quite frankly revolutionary ways. I honestly think her positioning of this marriage is radical. Like, when you think about the idea of the English novel, there is a particular way it was done. And this is not it. George Eliot really rallied against the idea that if you found the love of your life, all would be well. Yes, the novel does conclude with other marriages, mainly Dorothea and Will, but they're different, and we're gonna get into that. The marriage between Dorothea and Will is a representation of modern marriage. It upsets the conventional economy of marriage and the distribution of property in Middlemarch. What's that thing called that Cassavon, right? That is basically like blackmailing Dorothea. A codicil? Is that how you pronounce it? If you've read the book, you know what I mean. Basically, he's threatening to embroil Dorothea in scandal. So James expresses the fear that the world will suppose that she gave Cassavon some reason to legally keep Dorothea from Will. And that is what makes it so abominable, coupling her name with this young fellow's. Dorothea's brother rages that there never was a meaner, more ungentlemanly action than this. Mr. Brooke ironically insists that Ladislaw is a gentleman, to which Sir James replies, I am sure Cassavon was not. The contrast between the genteel clergyman and the reformed wayward dilettante. Okay, I need to give some context here. In my head, Will's really fit. In my head, Will Ladislaw is played by Sam Claflin. That's what's in my head, so I'm a little bit biased towards Will. What was I saying? Oh yeah, so the contrast between these two underscores the futility of social hierarchy that is keeping Dorothea and Will apart. But Dorothea does not give a fuck. Dorothea does not care about what the consequences are. She doesn't care what people around her think about her. She renounces her inheritance, declares her love for Will, and says, I don't mind about poverty. I hate my wealth. We could live quite well on my own fortune. It's too much. 700 a year. I want so little, no new clothes, and I will learn what everything costs. I mean, she's a little bit privileged, but she still defies like all of Middlemarch society to do what she wants. It's a true decision. It's not something that she is pre-programmed to do. Dorothea doesn't just disregard Will's questionable heritage. She seems to revel in it with her fascination with his grandmother's portrait. Maybe it's just like the mystery of Will. Maybe that's what's kind of hot. She does not care where Will is from, literally or within the social hierarchy. Marrying Will, badass independent woman decision. Because class and wealth has no bearing on this union. Dorothea and Will negate the predominant social reason for choosing a spouse in favor of a more modern, equitable, companionate union. The novel does not indulge in romantic declaration, but it's obvious that companionate marriages based on love triumph in the end. As a writer, George Eliot was deeply mistrustful of creating unrealistic expectations. We're going to talk about that more in a second. Because Dorothea and Will's union lacks the idealistic, romantic coyness of Rosamond and Lydgate, we don't have the time to get into the other characters, I'm sorry, and the intellectual idealism of Dorothea's attraction to Cassavon, it's ultimately a solid union. The marriage between Mary Garth and Fred Vincy also falls into this category of a solid mutual happiness. Throughout her career, George Eliot really fought against the idea that women could only produce frivolous writing. Now, from my knowledge, she probably would have put Jane Austen's novels in this category of frivolous writing, which I don't think is fair at all, and bitches should support bitches. But I definitely do think she has some points about those kinds of novels ending with marriage. And in this novel, she is really revolutionizing how people spoke about marriage. But in any text about the intimate and varied lives of humans, gender will be a factor. As I've previously spoken about, throughout Middlemarch we are presented with stark differences between the roles of men and women. From the very beginning of the novel, George Eliot makes it very clear what the male characters think about the female characters. I don't pretend to argue with a lady on politics. Your sex are not thinkers, you know. This largely mirrors what men thought at the time, and quite a few men now. And George Eliot presents us with a number of strong and defiant female characters in Dorothea, Mary, and Rosamond. And what I love about this trio of female characters is that they display their strength in different ways. All of these women have a desire for a greater purpose, but controversially, they all have to in some way use a man to fulfill that purpose. Dorothea is so strong-willed at the start of the novel, but she has to act through Sir James to fulfill her plan for the cottages. Her marriage to Cassavon is, as we've discussed, a complete failure. Even after this old dude dies, he's still trying to control Dorothea by effectively banning her from marrying Will. And I know we don't have time to get into them fully, but I find Lydgate and Rosamond really interesting because Lydgate really wishes that Rosamond could be on an equal footing to him. He could share the financial burden and occupational worries with her. It also seems like female characters who disobey men are punished. Rosamond has a miscarriage because she goes riding against her husband's wishes. Will's grandmother is disinherited because she married someone that her family didn't approve of. And Mary feels guilt knowing that, to a certain extent, she prevented Fred from getting his inheritance from Featherstone. And these are the main issues that George Eliot comes under fire for in whether this is a feminist novel or not. Critics argue that George Eliot did not give her characters the chance to fulfill their full potential. It's thought that George Eliot did not grant these female characters the same freedoms and opportunities that she herself had. In fact, Gilbert and Goober, who until I did my prep for this video I had kind of blanked them from my mind, and now I remember how much I read them in my English degree, they argue that in fact George Eliot has internalized patriarchal culture's definitions of women. But I don't understand how this novel isn't feminist when it accurately depicts the difficulties that so many women at this time face. The feminist views that George Eliot expresses in this novel, the themes that she analyses, were views that were shared by the likes of Mary Wollstonecraft. I think if we just focus on George Eliot's biography, it leads you to ignore more pertinent considerations, like everything that was going on in society at the time. No, George Eliot did not allow Dorothea to do the same stuff that George Eliot had been able to do in her life. Translate, publish articles, edit a periodical, refuse to marry until she was middle-aged, live an independent existence as a spinster and then live with a man that she couldn't marry. But Dorothea's greatest desire is education, not marriage. And I think that's the thing that I really love about Middlemarch. It feels like in a lot of these other books that end in marriage, it sometimes feels like the books are supposed to be about social change and reform and improving the lives of women, but they keep getting distracted by marriage. At points in Middlemarch, it feels like these women are supposed to be focusing on getting married, but they keep getting distracted by their personal desires, their need for education, their want of social change. Dorothea sees education as something that will enable her to act, for her to do stuff, for her to make change. Because Dorothea has this energy and desire that is not expected of women, there's no educational opportunities for her. Rather than allowing this desire and enthusiasm to be diffused, she figures out how to make it work. What does she do? She marries a guy that has books. Marrying Cassavon is one of the only educational opportunities Dorothea has. Eliot doesn't allow Dorothea to submit to what Cassavon expects of a wife. What Eliot is doing is demonstrating that this is one of the few opportunities for education that someone like Dorothea would have. By portraying Dorothea as suffering from a lack of vocation, Eliot criticizes rather than reinforces the restrictive and conventional society that offers marriage as the only outlet for women. And critics do find even more frustration with the idea of marriage in Middlemarch. It would be great if all of the female characters in Middlemarch could be exactly like George Eliot, had the exact opportunities that she had, but that wasn't accurate for the lives of most women out there. We can't really apply contemporary feminist standards to Middlemarch. I think characters like Dorothea were making the most of what they had. I think characters like Dorothea are hustling. And even when she does marry for love, it's a smart move. Women's work is met. Why does she marry Cassavon? Because she can't get a formal education. This is the closest that she can get. And yes, her marriage to Will is more complicated than that. It is more companionable than that. But it does give her some opportunities as well. There is no imbalance of power between Dorothea and Will like there is between Dorothea and Cassavon. Dorothea has great influence over Will, but it's something that he welcomes. He values her. He values her input and opinions. He's receptive to her thoughts and ideas and allows her the space to express them. And look, I know that's a low bar, but we're working with what we've got. Her marriage to Will is empowering. Will's later role as an ardent public man allows Dorothea an outlet to do good in the world. If Dorothea could not be an MP, she could be an MP's wife. And I know that the standard should be higher than that. But like, Michelle Obama wasn't president. That doesn't mean that she wasn't super smart, super qualified, and did amazing change in the world. Some of the opportunities she had to do phenomenal things in the world were brought her way because of who her husband was. It doesn't mean she's not great. Did I just compare Dorothea Brooke to Michelle Obama? Yes, I fucking did. I realize there are some big reasons why that comparison doesn't quite work, but I know what I mean. So they were all my thoughts on this beast of a novel. Do leave me a comment down below and let me know if you share any of my thoughts, if you disagree with any of my thoughts, and let me know if you would be interested in me doing another video that is similar to this one. I definitely won't promise that it's something that I can do all of the time, but I did mention Sense and Sensibility, which is a book that I really enjoy. We can enjoy George Eliot and Jane Austen. Or Alice's Adventures in Wonderland is another book that I could do a pretty deep dive on, so let me know. Congratulations on making it to the end of this video if if you did. Leave me a book emoji down below so I know you made it this far and are the true MVP. That's all I'm going to talk about today. I hope you guys are doing well, and I will talk to you in my next video.